Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Most of us are familiar with the hymn, Holy, 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 and we know it as a hymn, but we also sing a version of it right before we receive Holy Communion. I remember about 10 years ago we were interviewing for a musician, and in one interview I asked the candidate, if you had to do away with everything else in our liturgy and could keep only one part, what part would that be? His answer was the Holy, Holy, Holy right before communion. He found the praise and worship of God for God's gift of grace in Jesus to be received in bread and wine a very powerful element of our worship together. We hired him. This week we are learning all about angels, and I'm using a book called Sacred Origins of Profound Things by Charles Panatti to guide our moments together. So far, we have looked at how angels are common to just about every world religion, and then we looked at angels in the Old Testament and then in the New Testament. Today, I want us to consider cherubim and seraphim and something you've probably never heard of called the triads. Let's start with cherubim. Originally, the cherubim were heavenly beings who supported God's throne or chariot. In Genesis, they flashed fiery swords, and in fact, when Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, God put a cherubim there with a sword to guard the entrance, lest Adam try to return. Cherubim are described in different ways throughout the Old Testament. The cherubim that guarded the tabernacle where the Ark of the Covenant was kept were described as having 2 wings and 1 face. Later in Ezekiel, cherubim are described as having 4 wings and 4 faces. In an interesting side note, the 4 faces are a man's, a lion's, an ox's, and an eagle's. And later on in the Christian church, those 4 became the symbols representing the gospel writers. Again, the cherubim's main purpose was to bear God's throne in the inmost sanctuary called the Holy of Holies. They are known for their great mobility, but not as message bearers. Later on, the Christian church image of cherubim changed to a chubby, rosy-cheeked tot with small wings, which is why we sometimes call a pudgy human child a cherub. The seraphim come from a Hebrew verb meaning to burn, and they were seen as creatures of fire. In ancient Israel, seraphim were thought to surround God's throne, continually chanting God's praises. Isaiah tells us that each of the seraphim had 3 pairs of wings, and what they sang was the song, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of God's glory. God's threefold holiness permeates the fabric of creation. In the early Christian church, through the Middle Ages, people worked to develop their ideas of angels and their ranks. One man, whose real identity is unknown, went by the name of Dionysius the Areopagite. He sought to understand the hierarchy of angels and spiritual forces that appear throughout the Bible, and he arranged them in triads. The first triad contained the highest order of angels, led by the seraphim. They most resemble God as they sing God's praise. Second were the cherubim, which exist purely to worship God. The third part of this triad was called thrones, and Ezekiel describes them as wheels with many eyes, and the cherubim never seem to go anywhere without them. Their duty seems to be to oversee justice in heaven. These thrones were considered to be a separate class of angels. This first triad was called the faithful, because they never wander far from God and God's throne. The second triad starts with a class of angels called dominions. Dominions are celestial housekeepers, regulating life's hustle and bustle in heaven. They keep track of the large heavenly workforce and assign duties to lesser angels. Virtues are the second part of this triad, and the virtues are among the best loved angels on earth. Virtues work miracles like healing the sick. They provide support in hard times and dispense courage and God's grace. Legend says that virtues helped Eve in labor and escorted Jesus to heaven after his resurrection. The third part of this triad is called powers, and the job of the powers is to protect humankind from evil. They watch over each person and try to shield each one from Satan's influence. They battle evil head on. Members of this triad are ministering angels, watching over and caring for all heaven and earth. The final triad begins with principalities, which hover near the earth and are preoccupied with the welfare of nations and cities. Archangels make up the second part of this triad, and they are the chief guides and messengers for human beings. They are emissaries who work tirelessly between God and God's creation. We will talk more about them tomorrow. Finally, in this triad, we have the group known simply as angels. They are numerous and do much the same thing as archangels, but don't have the same status. For really important messages, For really important messages, God sends an archangel. Lower messages come through these regular angels. These angels are the closest to human beings, carrying God's messages to us and our prayers to God. This third triad could be called ministering angels, and their realm is the work of God among people. Now, it should be said that this part about the triads is one way of understanding the heavenly realm. And it is interesting, but we are attempting to speak of heavenly things with earthly limitations. The only thing we really know is that angels are God's messengers who speak God's word to us and enact God's will. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.